Good afternoon. The good news is that we are at overflow capacity. That means you just have to be a little bit patient while the air conditioning adjusts to all of your presence, which we're very happy about. I am Barbara Boehm. I'm a curator in the Department of Medieval Art and the Cloisters. And on behalf of my department head and the education department, I am very pleased to welcome you this afternoon and very pleased that we can be offering this lecture program, which we are doing in cooperation with the Yeshiva University Museum and its exhibition of the Brzezinski collection. The Metropolitan Museum likes to think of itself as an encyclopedic collection, and we are the most encyclopedic collection in this country. At the same time, there are parts of the history of art that are represented by those entries on Wikipedia yet to be written. And one of the most notable in that realm is the importance of the Jewish artistic heritage. There are a number of reasons for that, not the least of which is that the Jewish people themselves have been very diligent about preserving their heritage over the centuries, not the least of which is destruction of works of art, and not the least of which is that other institutions like the Bodleian Library, for example, which has a very important collection of Hebrew manuscripts, began collecting in the mid-1600s, right around the time that Jamestown was founded. So as the Met makes an effort to have our audiences be more aware of this important art, we have to look for innovative ways of doing that. And one of the things that we have done is to turn to our colleagues in sister institutions, especially in the New York area, for training. I am proud to say that I benefited from a program called the Institute for Jewish Art, offered by the Jewish Theological Seminary and the Jewish Museum, through loans, especially from the library of the Yeshiva University and most especially now from the Jewish Theological Seminary, which has made a major commitment to us in lending a major Hebrew manuscript to us at all times. And as today, for lectures related to exhibitions in the New York area, this is the second time that we've been able to offer lectures in conjunction with a program at the Yeshiva University Museum. For which we are very grateful for this afternoon's lectures, for the support of the Brzezinski family. And I will turn over now to my colleague, the director of the Yeshiva University Museum, Jacob Weiss. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I wanted to first thank Barbara Boehm and Melanie Holcomb, unfortunately, who couldn't be here. We're so delighted to be partnering with you, as Barbara said, the second in such a collaboration in just over 2 years, and it's really something that certainly complements and strengthens and really benefits both of us in a very large sense. So we're extremely grateful to you and for that to have happen. We're honored to collaborate, and I also just wanted to thank Joseph Lowe for his help in organizing this, to our museum staff, Rachel Lazen in particular, who has been instrumental in making this happen how well as it has. And to, in addition to the Brzezinski family, the Leon Levy Foundation and the David Berg Foundation, who provided key support for us to make the exhibition possible. As Barbara mentioned, this symposium goes together and complements really a remarkable exhibition that is currently at the Yeshiva University Museum called A Journey Through Jewish Worlds, Highlights from the Brzezinski Collection of Hebrew Manuscripts and Printed Books. The Yeshiva University Museum, if you do not know, is on West 16th Street between 5th and 6th. The exhibition is up until August 1st, and this, as rich a program as it is, I would invite you anytime in the next month until August 1st to come visit us. We would be delighted to see you there. I just really just wanted to just say a few things about the program. It'll be really, I think, a very broad and enjoyable complement to the exhibition and, as Barbara said, to the culture of Hebrew manuscripts. You will hear from a historian of the culture of these manuscripts, an art historian of the early medieval period around these manuscripts were made, and a curator talking about the more recent history, at least since Gutenberg. So it'll cover a lot of ground. And I will briefly introduce each speaker. After each talk, there will be, we'll have welcome a few questions from the floor. And then at the end, I'll also invite Sharon Mintz, co-curator of the exhibition, up for a panel discussion with the speakers, where we could also invite more questions from the audience. So our first speaker, Dr. Ephraim Kanarfogel, is Billi Ivry Professor of Jewish History at Yeshiva University's Stern College for Women, and Bernard Revel Graduate School for Jewish Studies, and I'm delighted to call him a colleague at Stern College. Professor Kanarfogel is a leading authority in the fields of medieval Jewish intellectual history and rabbinic literature. He is the author and editor of 5 books and has published more than 60 articles and reviews. His latest project focuses on the attitudes of rabbinic authorities during the Middle Ages towards apostasy and reversion, which sounds like a fascinating project. And he is the winner of a National Jewish Book Award for Scholarship and has held visiting appointments at the University of Pennsylvania and at Ben Gurion University of the Negev in Israel. He is also a fellow of the American Academy for Jewish Research, and I am honored and delighted to welcome him here. He's going to speak to us today on Hidden Treasure, the Intellectual Life of Medieval Ashkenazi Jews. Professor Kanarfogel.
Thank you very much, Jacob, Dr. Weiss. I feel as if I'm a member of the museum staff and faculty by now, as I do really of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. I've already invited myself back, and I want to thank both facilities for tremendous help, and as you'll see, tremendous technical expertise that I think without which our talks would be very difficult to do. Do you hear me back there? Yes? Okay. You will be hearing shortly from 2 distinguished colleagues about aspects of how manuscripts and books were produced, which I am certain will generate some very interesting narratives and ideas in addition to the beautiful art that is involved. Understanding the production and the value of manuscripts from both the artistic and the practical standpoints requires a fine eye for art and an intimate knowledge of how scribes and other artisans, patrons, and collectors went about their business, in addition to being quite familiar with the texts and illuminations that the manuscripts contain. Although I very much like to look at fine art, my eye for such things is narrow at best, and I possess only a rudimentary knowledge of the myriad dimensions of manuscript production. So you might correctly ask, why am I here today? Mainly, I think, so that my parents, who are in the audience, will be able to say that their son has been accorded the honor of having been invited to lecture at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, a very high honor indeed. My deficient artistic talents notwithstanding, I do have the great privilege of reading Hebrew manuscripts and working with them as both vocation and avocation. And so I'm here today to talk a little bit about how the contents of Hebrew manuscripts has the power to inform and even to transform not only what we know about a particular manuscript text that's in front of us, about its author, about his or her Sitzumleben, but also on a much broader level to teach us important things about Jewish intellectual life and culture about which we might otherwise have had little or even no awareness. A case in point, as the title of my talk suggests, concerns Ashkenazic or Franco-German Jewry in the 12th and 13th centuries. As a means of comparison to help us in locating this period in terms of Jewish intellectual history, if I were to poll this august audience, not going to do it, but if I were, to name a leading Spanish or Sephardic rabbinic figure in each of these centuries, in the 12th and 13th centuries, and here you can start thinking about what you would have answered, I suspect that when the votes are tabulated, 2 names would be far in the lead. First, very good, Maimonides, Rambam, who was born in the south of Spain in Andalusia in 1135 or 1138, and who died in Egypt in 1204, and Nachmanides, Ramban, Moses ben Nachman, who was born in northern Spain in Catalonia in 1194, and who died in Israel in the year 1270, a few years after he was forced to leave Spain in the wake of his successful defense of the Talmud and Jewish doctrines during the famed disputation at Barcelona in 1263. As I like to say, the good news is that he won the debate. The bad news is that they had to leave the country. Both Maimonides and Nachmanides are outstanding interpreters of the Talmud and decisors of halakha, Jewish law, who also excelled in other areas of intellectual endeavor. Philosophy clearly was Maimonides' other passion, as reflected especially in his Moreh Nevuchim, the Guide for the Perplexed, while Nachmanides was also a leading Kabbalist and scholar of Jewish mysticism, as emerges quite clearly from his commentary to the Torah. And if we can get the slide to go, there we are. Shazam. This is, by the way, everything that I'm going to show you is from the Brzezinski collection. This is actually from the Ankenubula, and you'll hear a little bit about it from a completely different angle from my colleague Emil Shriver. This is the introduction and the beginning of Nachmanides' commentary to the Torah, and you have the dates, the suggested dates at the bottom. If you look at his commentary to the Torah, Nachmanides as a mystic is very, very obvious. I won't go through the text now, but even towards the end of the piece on top, you'll see already in the introduction his indication that he will talk about Sodot HaTorah, mystical secrets. So that was his other discipline. It is abundantly clear that both Maimonides and Nachmanides were familiar with large amounts of the Muslim or Christian intellectual culture. Maimonides' case, it's Muslim. Nachmanides' case, it's both Muslim and Christian. The cultures that surrounded them as well. To put it in terms of the motto of Yeshiva University, they were both tremendous exemplars of Torah Umada, knowledge of Torah and of scientific and other substantive disciplines and approaches, which reflected great intellectual curiosity and capacity on their part. And I just show you here from the Brzezinski collection this interesting chart of intercalation of computing the Jewish calendar, scholars of Jewish law. They also had to be aware, certainly, of astronomical phenomena. And astrology in this period is also considered a science. So this is this blend and this awareness of both of these disciplines at a very, very high level. If we now turn back to 12th and 13th century Ashkenaz, and we run the same quiz, northern France and Germany, the two or three greatest names in this period come from a group of Talmudic scholars and interpreters known as the Tosafists. Those are people, it's not a condition. For the 12th century, we might choose a grandson of Rashi, Jacob ben Meir, known as Rabbeinu Tam, who died in 1171, or Rashi's great-grandson, Isaac ben Samuel of Dompierre, best known simply by his initials Rabbi Isaac, who died in 1189. For the 13th century, we might mention Eliezer ben Yoel Halevi, known by the acronym Raviyah, of the Rhenish settlements in Bonn and Kelm, who died circa 1225, or perhaps one of the last of the Tosafists, Meir ben Baruch Maharam of Rothenburg, who died in 1293. What is common to all of these Ashkenazic figures is that they are known primarily for their Talmudic and halachic scholarship. They and their students authored countless Tosafot, literally addenda, to Rashi's Talmudic commentary and really to the Talmud itself, responsa, in which they addressed specific questions or situations at length, discrete halachic rulings that are usually called pisakim, and larger works of Jewish law. Even from our very brief discussion to this point, it appears obvious that while leading Sephardic Talmudists and halachists, like Maimonides and Nachmanides, also often excelled in other fields, several of which had roots in and methodologies derived from the surrounding culture, the Tosafists in France and Germany were just that. Composers of Talmudic Tosafot and related internal genres, to use a phrase, and not much else, as important and impactful as their Tosafot and halachic writings were over subsequent generations, and indeed to this very day. This comparison is sharpened further when we consider that Rashi, whose dates are 1040 to 1105, the progenitor and major teacher of the early Tosafists, as we have noted, managed to compose not only a commentary to almost all of the Talmud, which was undoubtedly an absolute first, but also a highly innovative yet consistent commentary to the entire Pentateuch and to virtually all of the remaining books of the Bible. When students sometimes ask me how Rashi managed to accomplish this, I sometimes reply by telling them that he was able to write with both hands and both feet at the same time. This is, of course, a complete fabrication, but it's really the only way to explain, at least some way to explain, the sheer volume, never mind the overwhelming creativity of his oeuvre. And here we have, again, from the Brzezinski collection, the title page to the Venice 1522 edition of Rashi's commentary, and we have behind it Bereshit, the beginning of his commentary, And as Dr. Weiss suggested, there's more at the museum, and it really is very, very important. Rashi, his commentary to the Torah, exists in more than 100 manuscripts from all kinds of different locales and provenances, not just in Ashkenaz, but really throughout the Jewish world in the medieval and early modern periods, and that really is a very striking testimony to the popularity and to the importance of his work. So Rashi does Talmud, Rashi does Bible. The leading early modern Sephardic rabbinic scholar and bibliophile, Chaim Yosef David Azulai Chida, who died in Egypt in 1806, records a statement from Rabbeinu Tam, which does not appear within Rabbeinu Tam's own writings that have survived, but which does accord with a number of his statements that have been preserved in Tosafot texts, and I will paraphrase. My Zeta, my grandfather Rashi, could do it all, interpreting both the Talmud and the Bible. We, however, will have to content ourselves with only one area, the Talmud. Nonetheless, fairly recent manuscript research has revealed that Rabbeinu Tam did compose a very substantial and substantive commentary to the biblical book of Job, as did others of his colleagues in northern France in the 12th century. Most recently, really about a month or two ago, it has been suggested that Rabbeinu Tam, rather than his brother Rashbam, was also the author of a commentary to the book of Esther, which refers to Rashi's commentary on Esther as that of Zikeni, again my grandfather. This exegetical activity also serves to confirm that Rabbeinu Tam was the author of a lengthy treatise on scriptural grammar and syntax, which interacts with the works of two 10th century Sephardic grammarians, Menachem ben Saruk and Dunash ibn Labrat. Some had questioned Rabbeinu Tam's authorship of this work in light of the fact that he did not seem particularly interested in biblical commentary for its own sake. The manuscript evidence, however, again some of which has been uncovered only very recently, supports this additional interest on the part of Rabbeinu Tam. And so his statement about his grandfather was a modest one, and it reflects the fact that he was not able to do the entire range, but the interest in biblical studies is certainly there. Similarly, Rabbeinu Tam was a prolific author of liturgical poetry, piyutim. One of his compositions, that's actually not for the period of the High Holy Days when many congregations recite additional piyutim, but this one nonetheless is still recited in many Ashkenazi congregations even today, is an Aramaic poem that begins with the phrase, Itziv pitgam la'at udgam, may my words of interpretation be accepted to the one who dwells on high. This liturgical poem was recited in conjunction with the Haftarah, the prophetic reading on the second day of the festival of Shavuot, following the Torah reading. The custom in medieval Ashkenaz was to recite the Aramaic translation of the Haftarah on that day, and Rabbeinu Tam's liturgical poem was meant to serve as a meaningful introduction to this somewhat unusual performance. Interestingly, this poem, Yetziv Pitgam, was composed in excellent Spanish or Arabic meter, as was a parallel poem that Rabbeinu Tam composed to be recited at the conclusion of the prophetic reading. And it has a single rhyme at the end of each line throughout, which, if you think about it, greatly tests the skills of the poet, who had to convey his message in such a limiting rhythmic structure. It actually makes it more difficult. The rhyme is the same, but you've got to get all your thoughts into that particular very limited rhyme scheme. It also has an internal rhyme scheme within each line. What is even more interesting, at least to me, however, is that manuscript passages, several of which were published fairly recently in Professor Yonah Frankel's edition of the Machzor for Shavuot, reveal that Rabbeinu Tam was not the only northern French Tosafist to compose liturgical poems for this occasion. We may say, with apologies to the late great Jules Nipsey Russell, that each of these Tosafists was a poet, and he probably did know it. With apologies to Nipsey Russell. Now, here you have, by the way, a wonderful source as a genre for a lot of this material, and these are Machzorim and Sidurim. Here's a prayer book according to the Ashkenazic Rite, again for the Brzezinski collection. This particular page actually has something very familiar. This is not one of these fancy piyutim. This is, as you can see in the very large letters, Seder Shel Lele Pesach, the Passover Seder. And here just a point of methodology. Reading manuscripts is not a simple thing. It's a skill. It can be learned. But one of the keys to enter into this world, as one of my professors once said very profoundly, there's always a piece in a manuscript that you know, that's familiar. So, for example, it's very easy, relatively speaking, for those who are able to read Hebrew, to read this medieval script, Seder Shel Lele Pesach, and you can start to develop how does the copyist make each letter, and so on and so forth, and from then you sort of transition into more difficult sections. So the fact is these piyutim sometimes are hard to find and recognize, because since we don't know what they are, until you can read what you have and understand where it may be going, it's an interesting project and problematic. It's a lot of fun too. But the way you start is to start with something as simply beautiful as this and work your way out. Indeed, one of these Tosafists, Yom Tov ben Isaac of Joigny, which is located in the Burgundy region of northern France, a student of Rabbeinu Tam, whose name is cited on a number of occasions in the standard Tosafot of the Talmud, and who also authored at least one liturgical poem for the second day of Shavuot, which opens with a phrase very similar to the opening of his teacher's poem. Yom Tov's opening phrase is, Yatziv ev'eh kadam kudsha. I will strongly implore the Holy One. This Yom Tov of Joigny composed nearly 100 distinct interpretations to verses in the Torah. Only a small number of these, however, can be found in published collections of interpretations. I found the vast majority of these comments in manuscripts from the British Museum in London and the Russian National Library in St. Petersburg, and especially in a manuscript from the Bavarian National Library in Munich. Now, I must confess that I did not travel to all of these places to do this work. And if someone wants to ask me in the question period about how you get to see all of these manuscripts on the same day and in the same place, I'll be happy to explain. And the answer is not digitization, at least not yet. So this is a very interesting issue which we can talk about later in terms of how do you do this. Yom Tov of Joigny's comments to the Torah are similar, but certainly not identical to those of Rashi. Like Rashi, however, Yom Tov had a flair for offering simple yet precise interpretations which speak to a wide popular audience, as I might say in Old French, Zehat Kintam. They're really very, very good. If you follow that Old French, you have a problem, and we'll talk about that later too. One example of a very original and sensitive interpretation by Yom Tov that I have found nowhere else. Toward the end of the book of Exodus, following the sin of the golden calf, Moses asks God if he can, quote, behold his glory, if he can apprehend and see the glory of God. The Almighty responds somewhat abruptly to Moses, literally translated that no person can see me and live. Kilo yirani ha'adam v'chai. Yom Tov explains this to mean that if a human being were to actually see God, he would no longer wish to live in the human realm. He would no longer want to remain on earth, but he would feel compelled to remain with God. Kilo yirani ha'adam v'chai. If you see me, you will no longer want to continue to exist as a human being. The implication is that God, therefore, could not allow Moses to see him at this time, since Moses was still needed by God to complete his earthly mission, a very original and sensitive interpretation indeed. My research has shown that there were a total of 5 or 6 such Tosafists who offered these kinds of interpretations in large number. The last of these Tosafists was Rabbi Moses ben Jacob of Kusi, who is best known as the author of the major work of Jewish law, Sefer Mitzvot Gadol, the abbreviation SMAG, no Los Angeles connection that I know, that he composed around 1240, and that was copied in quite a number of medieval manuscripts. But here we have to say that the manuscript of the SMAG, dated 1288 in the Baginski collection, is the earliest known manuscript of the Sefer Mitzvot Gadol. Here you have one of the scribes describing the copying, and here you have another piece. It's bound beautifully, and I must say, when I went on a tour of the museum exhibition at the Yeshiva University Museum with Professor Weiss, I hope he didn't notice, but I had a little tear in my eye, because when you see this kind of work in this earlier version, you sort of believe that things can yet be found, and that we really have been very privileged to find these things. And obviously then you need Rene Brzezinski to be clever enough to purchase it and to let us show it. So this is the SMAG. Now, this is found, this is his halachic work. This we know. We just happen to have the earliest manuscript of it, which is wonderful. But his comments to the Torah, by Moses of Kusi's comments to the Torah, are found only sporadically within 1 or 2 much larger printed compilatory collections of comments, where they are sometimes referred to as Pishatei Rabbi Moshe Mikutsi, the simple or the basic interpretations of Moses of Kusi. A few scholars have taken notice of these comments, but frankly, they didn't really know what to make of them. Here, I'll give you an example. Again, the verse when Leah gives birth to her third child from Jacob, she names him Levi, and the biblical verse says, Hapam yilaveh ishi elai. Levi, my husband, will accompany me now, because I have given him 3 sons. Rashi interprets this based on the rabbinic notion that the Rachel and Leah and the maidservants knew that they would all be married to Jacob. He would have 12 children. 4 times 3 is 12. Each one had to have sort of a minimum of 3 children. So Leah has basically said, I've met my quota. My husband will now be happy. Things worked out differently, but that's the way Rashi interprets it. Moses of Kusi offers a much more plain sense of scripture, which is just wonderful, and it has a ring of what we would call realia. Moses of Kusi says the following, my husband will now stick with me because I've given birth to 3 sons. She says as follows, Leah says, now I will take care of 1 child. The maidservant can take care of the 2nd child. We're going to need him to do something with the 3rd kid. So basically, he can't just dump all 3. We can't hold all 3, right? There's no musical chairs here. And therefore, the notion that Yilaveh Ishi Elai, he will be involved. He will have to be now permanently involved with the family since, 2 arms, but in each case, interestingly, 1 child per person. Very insightful, pshat, simple, plain sense of scripture with, again, a realia-based flavor, which is really emblematic of this type of interpretation. And really, no one knew that Moses of Kusi authored these kinds of comments in addition to his major halachic work. The presence of these and additional comments in a number of manuscripts allows us to recognize that Moses of Kusi was in fact the last of a series of Tosafist colleagues who were involved with this dimension of biblical interpretation in addition to their seminal work as halachists. And so, we have Tosafists writing liturgical poems, which we mostly did not know about or did not know about at all until these poems were found in manuscript. And we have Tosafists writing biblical commentaries that we did not know about prior to the manuscript research, which located or expanded them. Perhaps the most surprising area of endeavor, however, and this is the last area that I'll speak about, is the deep interest of a series of Tosafists from both Germany and northern France in what we might call formulaic or white magic and related mystical teachings and concepts. Scholars have noted that the German pietists, Hasidei Ashkenaz, who flourished in the late 12th and early 13th centuries, alongside of and occasionally, sometimes more than occasionally, at odds with the Tosafists, were well versed in a mystical corpus that was originally produced somewhere from the end of the Talmudic period and into the Gaonic period, 400 to 800, perhaps 600 to 1,000, something like that, known as the literature of the heavenly palaces, the so-called Sifrut HaHechalot. This corpus of essentially rabbinic mysticism precedes the appearance of medieval Kabbalah and its major works, including such works as Sefer HaBahir or the Zohar, for example, and is not yet concerned with or even aware of the theurgic system of the 10 Sefirot. Hechalot mysticism entails principally the invoking and understanding of various divine and angelic names that can be used to achieve important states of being and other missions. As it turns out, however, there were also Tosafists who cited passages and sections of Hechalot literature and who expressed interest in related magical techniques that were heretofore thought to have been limited to the small circle of the German pietists. Now, there are scattered references to these phenomena in published works. And if we look here, we have, again, in the Brzezinski collection, another important halachic work, the Sefer Mitzvot Katan, the smaller book of mitzvot, which is not simply an abridgment of the Smag, it's a different work. The author, Isaac ben Joseph of Corbeil, dies in 1280. And towards the very beginning of this halachic compendium, really in the 3rd section, there's a brief narrative about Rabbi Judah HaChassid, one of the leaders of the German pietists, in which Rabbi Isaac quotes Rabbi Judah as he sets out for his students the parameters for when divine names can be invoked as a means of securing physical protection from highwaymen or from natural dangers, and when such usages are prescribed. So at the very beginning of a very important halachic work in this beautiful manuscript, and we have, here's the sort of table of contents, in either section 3 or 4, we've got this kind of magical, mystical not tour, a mystery tour, no, but we've got a magical, mystical approach right there, which again, people say, well, that's kind of odd, and they sort of leave it alone. What I'll show you again from the manuscripts is it's not quite as odd as it sounds at all. There is really a whole literature here, most of it sitting in manuscript. Let me give you another print example, and we'll move to the manuscripts. The early 13th century halacha compendium, Shibolei Haleket, Ears of Gleaning, because it is a likut, it's a collection. This was composed by Tzidkiah ben Abraham Harofei Anau, Min HaAnavim, with a Vav, who had an acute familiarity with rituals and practices that originated in northern France and Germany. And this, again, in the Brzezinski collection, is one of the earliest manuscripts that we have of this work. There's a little debate exactly when this work was written, and so the earliness may depend on that, but it still is very, very early. Another tear formed in my eye when I saw this one, because this is a very, very important work as well. Shibolei Haleket notes, among other mystical phenomena, that at the occasion of the burning of the Talmud in Paris in the 1240s, unnamed rabbis in northern France undertook a mystical dream question in order to ascertain whether this decree had the approbation of the heavens. This sounds very similar to the mystical journey undertaken by the Tana Rabbi Yishmael, as recorded in a number of midrashic and liturgical texts, to confirm that the fate of the 10 rabbinic martyrs during the Roman period, the so-called Asara Harugei Malchut, had in fact been sanctioned by the heavenly tribunal. Nonetheless, it is only through manuscript research and study that the full measure of these interests comes to the fore, which allows us in turn to read the printed text in a new and more ramified light. Several non-Ashkenazic manuscripts, the earliest of which is dated 1286, contain a series of divine and angelic adjurations and mystical formulae attributed to Rabbeinu Tam that was intended to provide the one who recited them with various forms of physical protection, forgiveness for his sins, the ability to retain Torah knowledge, and with long-lasting success in both temporal and spiritual matters. Two of these manuscripts attribute this text to the Tana Rabbi Yishmael as well. And we actually once received a laminated palm card containing one of these texts at a wedding, being given out to the guest as a gift, say the magic words and sort of win a prize. As I told my wife, however, while I cannot vouch for the effectiveness of these recitations, I know that the attributions to Rabbeinu Tam and Rabbi Yishmael are probably inaccurate. And she replied, of course, that this is why she can't take me anywhere. Let me tell you what the correct attribution should be. A single manuscript from the mid-13th century, making it earlier than any of the manuscripts that I just referred to, and currently housed in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, contains all of these various mystical adjurations and requests, with the name of an Isaac ben Isaac, Isaac son of Isaac, as the copyist or as the client, as scholars of medieval magic like to refer to them, meaning the one who was listed as reciting these formulae and thereby benefiting from their recitation. Rabbi Isaac ben Isaac of Chinon was a northern French Tosafist of the mid-13th century who had connection to the Tosafist study hall at Ivry, which is in Normandy. This study hall has been shown to have had literary, if not personal, contact with the German pietists, and it is crystal clear that Isaac of Chinon is the original author or user or client for these passages. Subsequent copyists, however, who were unfamiliar with Isaac, whose achievements as a Tosafist can be documented, but who was certainly not one of the most outstanding figures in northern France during the 13th century, the copyists said, "We never heard of him, so we'll substitute the name of the much more famous French Tosafist Rabbeinu Tam." It's a lovely, clever Hebrew expression, "Harotzeli talot yitalel bilan gadol." If you're going to blame it on somebody big. And there's a double entendre there too. And they even included the name of Rabbi Yishmael. It's not this Isaac, we didn't hear of him, it's Rabbeinu Tam, it's Rabbi Yishmael, who knows? Rabbeinu Tam does not appear to have been involved in mystical studies and practices, even as he is familiar with certain mystical constructs and teachings. Rather, these and other related formulae originated within documented Tosafist study halls in northern France during the first half of the 13th century, and reflect the tendencies of these study halls toward mystical theory and practice. Already in the 12th century, though, Tosafists such as Rabbi Eliezer ben Samuel of Metz, who was a direct student of Rabbeinu Tam, endorsed methods whereby one person can bind another, while both of them are still alive, to the effect that the one who perishes first will appear to his friend in a dream and answer questions about his experiences following his death. These will not be the questions we will answer here later, but that's what this was about. Dream questions to resolve halachic matters or to address other rabbinic issues, as we have noted with regard to the burning of the Talmud, were put forward by a number of Tosafists in both the 12th and 13th centuries and are recorded in both published and manuscript passages. Rabbi Yechiel ben Yosef of Paris, a leading northern French Tosafist, who, as you may know, attempted to defend the Talmud during the trial of the Talmud, the disputation that occurred in Paris in 1240, describes in a manuscript passage that has only recently been published that he had contact with a departed soul of a righteous person who did not look very well. Literally, the soul appeared to be green around the gills, panav morikot. Yechiel learned that this person appeared this way because the angels, he had been a righteous person after all, were nonetheless mistreating him a bit. They would apparently toss him up in the air, but would then fail to catch him. This is my version of what they call angelic ringolevio. This was his punishment for talking at a somewhat subtle point during the prayers on Friday evening. Interesting punishment for that. Among his other mystical interests, Yechiel of Paris offered an interpretation of the Kel Adon hymn, which is included in the Shema prayer on the morning of the Sabbath, which itself is based on passages within Hechalot literature. Yechiel's commentary ascribes the content of Kel Adon to considerations of the divine throne and the number of wings or the structures of the various heavenly figures, angels, and so on, according to verses in both Isaiah and Ezekiel, as well as the so-called 72-letter name of God, a divine name that was known to mystics as it emerged from a series of letter combinations found within verses in the book of Exodus. Interestingly, the passage about the fate of the green-faced soul just mentioned appears in similar form in Sefer Hasidim and is included in the name of Yehuda Chassid in the major halachic code authored by Jacob ben Asher Arba'at Turim. And here we have the Braginsky collection, which has this first part of the Arba'at Turim in which this comment is contained, not on this page, but in this section. This is a major halachic work, and yet this halachic practice, don't talk at a certain point during Friday evening prayers based on this soul experience, right, soul, S-O-U-L, is included there. Although Jacob ben Asher wrote his work on Spanish soil, to which his family is forced to flee in the face of severe persecution in Germany in the early years of the 14th century, he spent the first 25 years or so of his life in Germany, studying with his father, Asher ben Yechiel, the Rosh, and with his father's teacher, Meir of Rothenburg, as well. Meir of Rothenburg was very involved in mystical studies and teachings, as reflected in a number of manuscript passages. Maharam composed formulae for protection, undertook a variety of dream questions, and sought through a number of recitations and practices to achieve the mystical state of Pitichat Halev, literally the opening of the heart, in which all Torah study is easily and permanently understood and remembered. It's kind of like that easy button for Torah study, but that's what he did. Jacob ben Asher Bal HaTurim also cites a ruling by the Italian Tosafist, Isaiah of Trani, Isaiah ben Mali or Emmanuel of Trani, who studied in his youth in the Rhineland with the leading Tosafist teacher Simcha of Speyer, to permit the recitation of divination formulas to locate lost objects or to locate the thief, the medieval Lojak, so long as they entailed invoking divine names and not the names of demons or Shadim. Jacob then cites his father, Rabbi Asher the Rosh, who allowed divination using Shadim for locating lost objects, as Rie of Dompierre apparently had done in the 12th century. Jacob ben Asher's contemporary in Germany, Isaac ben Elijah, allowed the adjuration of Shadim not only for locating stolen property, but also for knowing the future, Leida et ha'atidot. This passage was published from manuscript more than a half century ago, but by one of my earliest teachers at Yeshiva, the late Professor Irving Agus, as a small section in a volume entitled Teshuvot Ba'alei Tosafot, Responsa, or Writings of the Tosafists. So included in this halachic compendium was this advice that it was halachically permissible to do these magical things. Isaiah de Trani, mentioned above, was also one of several Tosafists who writes that he experienced a nocturnal appearance by the prophet Elijah, during which Eliyahu came to him in a dream and discussed with him and verified one of his complex rulings in the area of kashrut that went against the rulings of other authorities. As we can see, those Tosafists who were involved in matters of mysticism and magic were typically involved in more than one such instance, and it usually requires recourse to manuscript texts, in order to locate the full range of their activities. Just to sort of conclude here with another piece from Rabbi Meir of Rothenburg. Although I have pointed to specific examples from Hechalot literature only in passing, this corpus was a significant conduit for bringing mystical material to medieval Ashkenaz, as has been mentioned. Virtually every one of the Ashkenazic figures associated with mysticism and magic also cites passages from Hechalot texts. Indeed, in one of his many published responsa, Meir of Rothenburg concludes that once a person has decided to undertake martyrdom, to give up his life al Kiddush Hashem, he or she, in the sanctification of God's name, he or she will feel none of the pain of their deaths, regardless of the means of execution. Rabbi Meir supports his contention with two sets of textual proofs, one based on two parallel details within the Masoretic text of the Bible, and the other based on a passage of Sefer Hechalot, again involving the Tana Rabbi Hanania ben Tradion. However, Rabbi Meir saves his most striking proof for last, and I'm going to quote, "There is no one in the world who will not scream when he touches fire with even the smallest finger or limb. Even if he tries to restrain himself, he will be unable to do so. But we have witnessed many martyrs, Harbei Kedoshim Mosrim Atzmam al Kiddush Hashem, who were burned or otherwise killed and did not cry out at all." End quote. To be sure, most of the interest in mysticism that can be detected among the Tosafists, including the various examples that I presented here today, would appear to have nothing to do with issues of martyrdom or self-sacrifice. Nonetheless, one cannot help but wonder if at least part of this spiritual awareness might have emerged from the fact that Ashkenazic Jewry was charged and challenged by the possibility of martyrdom throughout the period under discussion. In any event, to sum up our findings and to locate their significance, manuscript research reveals dimensions of Tosafist thought and interest and of the intellectual life of Ashkenazic Jewry more broadly that would have remained relatively unknown if we were to rely only on printed texts and books. This is the hidden treasure of medieval Ashkenazi Jews that I had in mind in the title of my talk. Overall, these findings suggest that the Tosafists were not simply excellent and committed Talmudic scholars who had little interest in other disciplines or areas of study. Rather, the Tosafists emerged from the manuscripts as rabbinic scholars who participated in quite a range of additional intellectual hobbies or fields which they took quite seriously. And these include independent biblical interpretation, the writing of liturgical poems and commentary, magical and mystical teachings and practices, and much more. Ashkenazic intellectual insularity in these matters, which we now know, which I hope learned in the last few minutes, is largely untrue, as opposed to the much greater level of cultural symbiosis in medieval Spain and Sfarad more widely, that helped Sephardic Jewry to become interested in a very broad paideia, or educational curriculum, has been explained in the past as a factor of the different types of interaction or non-interaction between Judaism and Islam, where the sense was that it was more comfortable to interact in these intellectual ways, and Judaism and Christianity, where the sense was that in the medieval context, this is what led to greater insularity and to less symbiosis and involvement. Additionally, there's an important linguistic issue with regard to the surrounding culture. Arabic was both the lingua franca, the vernacular in the Muslim world, as well as the language of culture. If Jews could speak and read Arabic, they could involve themselves with little additional training in some form or some aspects of Muslim culture. Latin, which was the language of the writings of the learned scholars in Western Christendom, however, was not typically known on any level by most Jews, and we can talk further about this in the question period as well. As we have seen, however, again, especially and precisely on the basis of manuscripts and manuscript research, Ashkenazic rabbinic scholars who lived in Christian Europe were also not intellectually one-sided. This suggests that a Torah Umara approach depends not only on the surrounding culture, but also emerges from within Jewish tradition itself, of which the Tosafists and other Ashkenazic scholars had a very firm mastery and grasp. Genuine Torah scholarship presumes breadth as well as depth, and it requires that all areas of Torah study and endeavor be plumbed in search for a comprehensive understanding of Jewish learning and tradition. If they had manuscript study and research in mind as well for this enterprise, I will happily plead guilty, and I hope that after today you will too. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that eye-opening, enlightening talk. I guess the first question I would just ask, which I think a lot of people want to ask you, is how do you do it? How do you see all those manuscripts in one day?
Okay, well, There are two answers, and I will mention institutions, but again, as examples. If one wants to see a group, and certainly a large number, of manuscripts, both in the flesh and on microfilm, which if you're looking for texts, you can certainly, in an initial study, do from microfilms. Jewish Theological Seminary here in America has quite a number of these manuscripts available, and they will let you in. You have to get the right hour. We have a lot of Jewish Theological Seminary faculty and staff here, including the head of the library. See him, I'm not going to tell you his name, but see him, and where he's sitting, and he will tell you how to do it. I actually spent quite a lot of time, and my university spends quite a lot of money sending me on various conferences, other universities as well, to the room where you can do all of this. And this is the room where you can go to every part of Europe, to Russia, everywhere. And that is the Institute for Microfilmed Hebrew Manuscripts at the National Library in Jerusalem. In a room that's not, I don't think it's bigger than this, it might be smaller. They have on microfilm 800,000 medieval, early modern manuscripts. They have an electronically done catalog, which I like to say is smarter than any 10 people that I know. And you can literally go around the world, not in 80 days, but in a few hours. I have been known to do a paper, fly in, spend 2 or 3 days, and just fly back out, because those 2 or 3 days can reveal, you have to have an idea of what you're looking for, and you have to have an idea, and you have to spend time reading. As one of my greatest colleagues, Moshe Dell, who's very well known, we once came to the conclusion that what you find in manuscripts when you're not looking is always the best. The things you find when you're not looking that just blow your socks off, and that really then puts you on a different direction. But that's how you do it. So in one day, you go around the world.
Are there any, maybe if you have 1 or 2 questions specifically related to Professor Kanarfogel's talk, Shelby, go ahead.
The Tosafists were the successors of Rashi in interpreting the Talmud in northern France and Germany, which is where Rashi lived and where he studied. So the greatness of Rashi is not just the writing with both hands and both feet. He wasn't just a scholar, as we would say, fazich alein, for himself. He was a scholar who then spawned an entire movement that really ran for about 200 years. And the standard page of the Babylonian Talmud, if you go into any synagogue or library and you open up a copy, or a yeshiva and open up a copy, or any place, of the Babylonian Talmud, Rashi will typically occupy the inside margin. Inside margin is always place of elders. Elders get on the inside seat, get the front rows. And the Tosafists, Tosafot, are on the outside margin surrounding the Talmudic text. So the point here is that the Tosafists were great Talmudists. We know. We find things in manuscript about that too, plenty. What we didn't know is about all of these other disciplines and interests. But the Tosafists themselves, they probably do have a Wikipedia entry. If I recall, it's not too bad, and not that that's the way you do scholarship. But either that, or I can sell you some books. But in any case, that's the basic answer.
Yeah, one more question.
On one of the projections you showed, the text was in a geometric form.
Yes.
Just repeat the question.
Yes, the question was that in one of the texts, I think the smog was probably the best example. We could even get back to that if we, yeah. Well, they've already turned me off. No, there we are. Good. Okay. I'm going to leave that to my manuscript colleagues, my artistic colleagues. Again, whether it's a way to point interest at that page. Very often these pages are what we call the colophons, the copyist name, and so on, or to highlight particular parts of the text. Sometimes the progressions are not meant as artistic stuff at all. They're meant because there's no more room on the page. Someone just published from manuscript a fantastic Tosafist commentary that exists in 2 manuscripts. He only knew about 1, but there's a second, where the commentary, there's a text of the Torah, there's a commentary, the Aramaic Targum Onkelos, on the inside margin, Rashi on the outside margin, and on the bottom of each page, in what I call those little round Band-Aids that I remember as a kid when you skin your knee, in those little Band-Aid round pieces are this entire commentary. Very difficult to read, not good micrography, but so sometimes it's a matter of function, sometimes it's a matter of art or of emphasis, and I will ask perhaps my colleagues on the artistic side to address that too, but you're right to pick it up. It's certainly there. Okay. Sure.
Great. Thank you very much.